Thank you so much for joining me this evening. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. West this evening. Cornel West is a prominent and provocative democratic intellectual. He is the class of 1943 professor at Princeton University. He graduated Magna Cum Laude from Harvard in 3 years and obtained his MA and Ph.D. in philosophy at Princeton. He is taught at Union Theological Seminary, Yale, Harvard, and the University of Paris. He has written 19 books and edited 13 more. He is best known for his classics, Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and his new memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. He appears frequently on the Bill Maher Show, the Colbert Report, CNN, C-SPAN, as well as on his dear brother Travis Smiley's PBS TV show. He is also the co-host of the popular radio show Smiley and West, heard on PRI around the United States. The Smiley and West Show is a highly acclaimed progressive program. He made his film debut in The Matrix and was a commentator on the official trilogy released in 2004. He has also appeared in over 25 documentaries and films, including The Examined Life, Call and Response, Sidewalk, and Stand. Last, he has made 3 spoken word albums, including Never Forget, collaborating with Prince, Jill Scott, Andre 3000, KRS-One, and the late Jarrell Levert. His spoken word interludes were featured on Terence Blanchard's Choices, the Cornel West Theory's Second Rome, Raheem DeVaughn's Love and War masterpiece, and most recently on Bootsy Collins' The Fun Capital of the World. In short, Dr. Cornel West has a passion to communicate to a variety of publics in order to keep alive the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy of telling the truth and bearing witness to love and justice. Now please help in giving me a warm welcome to Dr. Cornel West.
Thank you so very much. What a blessing it is for me to be here in London, Ontario, Canada. King's University College, University of Western Ontario. I already had such a wonderful conversation with some of the dynamic students here as well as in other colleges. And I must say that I first want to apologize for not being able to come early. I think most of you heard that my grandmother passed. As much as I wanted to come to be with you, you can imagine that when it comes to my grandmother, who I love so dearly and so very, very deeply, she was 97 years old, and we put her in the ground. She's never set a foot in a schoolroom whatsoever. Grew up in Gut Bucket, Jim Crow, Louisiana. And people often look at me and say, oh, Brother West, my God, your grandmother never went to school at all, and you're at Princeton. That must be an American success story. I said, no, don't get it twisted. No, not at all. No, I always put the cross much more at the center than any flag. I don't care which flag you're talking about. And by cross, I'm speaking both as a Christian, but also if you are a precious non-Christian. I'm talking about unarmed truth and unconditional love. That's what it's all about for me. And so I deeply appreciate you all being patient enough to postpone this and allow me to be here now. I want to thank Sister Amy Wood for those very kind words, and Brother Juan Diego Castro for your magnificent leadership here, and Brother Kojo Haywood. Appreciate it. Rich dialogue with you and the others, and Brother Eric Pablo, and I can go on and on and on. 2 very special brothers I want to acknowledge. One is my dear, dear brother, Bernie Hammond. Let's give him a hand. Let's give him a hand. Praise God. Where's Brother Bernie? Where's Brother Bernie? There he is. There he is. There he is. 35 years of high quality service. A PA in social justice. How rare that is in any institution. And last but not least is Brother Ted Smith. Where's Brother Ted from Toronto? Part of the legacy of Dorothy Day and Daniel Berrigan and Phil Berrigan, William Sloan Coffin, Neil Strong, and Ellen. And I must say, in all honesty, I am in no rush tonight. I don't have to be back in New York City until tomorrow. And it's Holy Week too. I really take my time because blood is about to flow. But I do hope that I say something both about solidarity, about courage, about vision, about service, about sacrifice that unsettles you, that unnerves you, maybe even for a moment, unhouses you. Because Brother Eric is right, we live in both a frightening time but also an exciting time. Oligarchic and plutocratic forces are reshaping the whole world and cosmos in their image and interest, and yet there is a deep democratic awakening taking place. Yes, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Greece, Spain, all over Latin America. Been at it for a long time. But then when it hits New York City, Wall Street, and then occupying the hoods in the south side of Chicago and Harlem, and I know it hit Canada too, though, didn't it? Oh, that Occupy movement is now global. And it is disproportionately those I call new school. I'm old school. See, my dear brother, that's so good to see you. You old school too. We together, brother. Oh, yeah. It's a magnificent thing to see young people hungry and thirsty for something more than the culture of superficial spectacle, of titillation and stimulation, obsession with just title and wealth and power. Say, no, we want to still talk seriously about non-market values like love and justice and trust and tenderness and sweetness and kindness. Those things that the market culture tries to fundamentally subsume, devalue, and marginalize. So I want to begin on a Socratic note this evening. I want to turn to line 38A of Plato's Apology. The unexamined life is not worth living. Our dear brother who was shot down like a dog 44 years ago in Memphis, Tennessee, Brother Martin Luther King Jr., you can hear him from the grave reminding us the examined life is painful. Be a long-distance runner in your solidarity with those Francis Fanon called the wretched of the earth. It takes courage, longevity, integrity, even magnanimity, greatness of character tied to hypersensitivity to those who are suffering. Now the Greek actually says the unexamined life is not a life for the human. And you know our English word human derives from the Latin humando. I know this great institution has a Catholic backdrop, doesn't it? Something like that Catholic education. Wouldn't have Shakespeare without the Jesuit education. Wouldn't have Diderot without the Jesuit education. Latin humando. Humando means what? Burying. That's where we get the word humanity. And humanities, we'll always remind our professors of humanities. That's really what you're dealing with. The dead. The conversation, the discourse, the concourse with the dead. And like the Sankofa bird that says what? We refuse to move forward until we first look backward to the best of the dead. real? That's the fundamental question of any serious talk about social movements. The fundamental question of any serious talk about solidarity. There's an existential dimension here. Wrestling with the most terrifying question, what does it mean to be human? Each and every one of us have to answer that question in the dark precincts of our own souls. What does it mean to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces? That's who we are. People ask me why I spend so much time with funk masters like Bootsy Collins and George Clinton. They remind us we all emerge in the funk. The love push of our precious mamas that got us out. Unless you had cesarean section. No matter what color, no matter what culture, no matter what civilization, sexual orientation, religious or non-religious, that is bottom line. How do you keep it real enough to acknowledge you're on a journey from your mama's womb, and one day your body will be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms? That's funky too. True. Mama's womb to tomb. You're not here that long. And the question is, what kind of human being are you going to choose to be? What kind of virtues? What kind of values? What kind of integrity? What kind of courage? Will you cut radically against the grain? Or will you be cowardly, well-adjusted to injustice, well-adapted to indifference toward others, trying to fit in rather than being a misfit when it comes to unjust status quos, when it comes to structures of domination and systems of oppression. And as someone from old school, I was blessed to grow up in the 1960s and 70s, so the Socratic question was always on the table. Angela Davis, Huey Newton, Malcolm X, Martin King, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, Tom Hayden. We can go across the board. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, reminding us constantly, who are you really? Do you really care? Marvin Gaye raised in 1971 and what's going on. Who really loves the babies? Who's willing to pay a price? Or, and with young folk, you all have to deal with a culture which everybody's up for sale. And everything is up for sale. Everything commodified, commercialized, privatized. And the question becomes, can you somehow negotiate and navigate that treacherous terrain and renew and reinvigorate Socratic energy of raising difficult questions? Now, I'm blessed to teach for 35 years, and each time students come in my room, I tell them, I say, you've entered my classroom in order to learn how to die. We can look at each other. We're in the right place. This brother told me to learn how to die. I just came to get my degree. No. No, you're missing the point. Montaigne, of course, one of the greatest of all early modern philosophies, Catholic brother, but very iconoclastic and idiosyncratic. The inventor of the genre called the essay. He said, to philosophize is to learn how to die. By philosophize, he meant falling in love with wisdom. Philosophia. Seneca says, he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery, shatters bondage. Learning how to die is what? Mustering the courage to critically examine whatever prejudices you might have. It could be white supremacy, this vicious legacy. Downplays precious humanity of black, brown, yellow, and red brothers and sisters. It could be male supremacy, loses sight of humanity, the vast majority of humankind, sisters of all colors. It could be imperial arrogance, thinking that somehow an American life has more value than a life in Yemen or Guatemala. It could be anti-Semitic, losing sight of the humanity of Jewish brothers and sisters. It could be anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, homophobic, across the board, losing sight of our precious physically challenged brothers and sisters. Whatever ideology it is that loses sight of the humanity of other folk, that particular prejudice or set of prejudices needs to die. It needs to be critically examined in such a way that you tried to kill it. Same is true in terms of our intellectual frameworks. Sufficient free markets generate prosperity and justice. What a lie. Needs to be critically examined. Maybe wholesale disciplines might go under. Especially the ones that are tied to oligarchic and plutocratic rule in our day. Frameworks, paradigms require courageous, critical scrutiny, learning how to die for what? In order to learn how to live. There is no maturity, there is no development, there is no growth without learning how to die. There is no rebirth without death. And I'm not saying that simply because this is Holy Week. That Good Friday is all about the death of God for a significant number of us. We didn't need Nietzsche. Gay Science section 125 to tell us about the death of God. We already knew about that. Especially if you wrestle with that Saturday after and you don't know Easter's coming. God is dead. Will there be maturity, compassion, development, self, society, humanity? Will there be rebirth? Qualitative difference between what the Greeks call paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, which is deep education, as opposed to cheap schooling. And we live at a moment, especially for our young folk, oftentimes it's really cheap schooling. Just want to gain access to that institution so I can get a skill and plug into the labor force, so maybe I can live a little large in the States, in a vanilla suburb, away from the city. But no, deep education is about the learning how to die that results in the turning of the soul that Plato talked about. The shift from the superficial to the substantial. The shift from the frivolous to the serious. The shift from the bling bling and the G-string to let freedom ring. Let courage ring. Let solidarity with those who are suffering ring. And that's why there's always an intellectual dimension of thinking. Malcolm X used to always say, when will people reach the point where they have the courage to think for themselves, listen for themselves, speak for themselves? Mind you, line 24a in Plato's Apology, where Socrates says, it was parrhesia was the cause of my unpopularity. That's why I was condemned to death. What is parrhesia? Fearless speech, plain speech, frank speech, unintimidated speech. Just try to tell the truth the best that we fallible, fallen human beings can do. And that's rare these days. Very few folk really want to tell the truth. How come? It's bad for their careers. Kanye West sitting up there, George Bush doesn't care about black folk. Boy, you flow so nice on the stage. How come it took you so long to tell the truth? Come on, Kanye. He's not my cousin. Oh, but see, Curtis Mayfield. All the agents telling Brother Curtis Mayfield, stay away from Martin, stay away from Malcolm, have nothing to do with the Black Panther Party. And he shows up with his guitar anyway. How come? Because he knew it was a matter of his calling, not just his career. It was a matter of his vocation and mission, not just his profession. He had a life task, not just a job. And most importantly, he was true to the anthem of black people in the United States, which is lift every voice. I don't know what the anthem is for black people in Canada. Y'all got to tell me. Whatever it is, I know it's beautiful though. Oh no, African people, wherever we go, we got something to say. Dang. But in the United States, it's lift every voice. But during the Ice Age, for the last 30 years, where it's been fashionable to be indifferent to poor people and working people, it has not been lift every voice, it's been lift every echo. Just want to be an echo. Just want to be extension of what is in place. Conformity, 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 not non-conformity. Cutting against the grain. I know young G's in town tonight. Yeah, he's my A-town brother. Staying in the same hotel. Hope I can get to the show. I love that brother. But he knows I spend a lot of time in the studio with hip-hop artists. Each time I come in, I tell them I come from a tradition that has been preoccupied with producing Socratic figures who attempt to be original in helping others. But I see too many copies. And there's a qualitative difference between being an original, like Gil Scott Heron, as opposed to a copy to make big profits and money for the oligarchs and plutocrats in the recording, radio, and video industry, generating deeply unsocratic reflections in its dominant forms. I'm not talking about immoral technique. I'm not talking about Brother Ali or some other folk or Erykah Badu. I'm talking about the mainstream for young people. How do we stay in contact with Socratic energy, critical consciousness, always tied to historical context, but fortifies the soul. Fortifies the soul. That's why I begin again with each and every one of us. Because in the end, we have to make a choice. What kind of life you want to live? What do you think they will say about you when you are where my grandmother was last week in the coffin? What kind of legacy will they talk about in relation to you? What kind of afterlife will you have in relation to those who come after? Were they courageous enough to raise the kind of questions that might get them in trouble? See, we had a Negro spiritual written by non-literate artistic geniuses under white supremacist slavery in the United States, called Wade in the Water. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. You don't find what is true and good and beautiful unless you actually go for trouble. What Samuel Beckett called the mess, or what I call the funk. The reality of suffering and sadness and sorrow, but also joy. I didn't say pleasure. I said joy. And the difference between the two is fundamental. Joy is communal. Joy is in the sparkle of the young brothers and sisters under 5 of all colors. Joy is in the eyes of grandma and granddad. Pleasure, you all know what that is. Especially when it's highly commodified and commercialized. So you keep coming back with your cash as consumer for more, 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 to be addicted and self-medicated, and thereby dampen Socratic energy. See, with Brother West, the leap from Socrates to social movements Seems to be a grand one. No, not really. Not really. Social movements have to do with those Sly Stone called everyday people unleashing Socratic energy, raising questions, and then deciding to act and put their bodies on the line. Organize, mobilize on issues that are connected to the endless, incessant quest for truth. And we understand truth in the empathetic sense. The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. There is no truth for we humans having to do with social practice in our individual lives or in our social, historical, and political lives unless suffering speaks. And we live in a moment where that suffering is beginning now to speak individually and collectively in a way that the powers that be have to take notice. See, in the United States, we've been experiencing a level of decay and decline that is difficult to describe. It's not just the 1% of the population that owns 42% of the wealth of the top 400 individuals who have wealth. That's all right, connect. Who have wealth equivalent to the bottom 150 million. Top 400 individuals in the empire have wealth equivalent to the bottom 150 million. And just last year, 93% of all of the income went to the top 1%. You say, oh, that's just a cliche of the Occupy movement. No, that's part of a social analysis. Crucial part of a social analysis. Poverty rates up higher than ever. Brother Tavis, Smiley and I just went on a poverty tour in August. We were embarking on an 18-city tour beginning next week. We just have a new book called The Rich and the Rest of Us, a Poverty Manifesto. Highest levels of poverty rates since 1959. And our precious indigenous brothers and sisters, and they don't have to be in the room for us to be hypersensitive to their suffering and their land, their babies violated, men and women crushed. In America, 40% red children, indigenous children living in poverty, 38% of Latino precious children living in poverty, 38% of black children living in poverty. In the richest nation in the history of the world, it's a moral disgrace, and yet very little talk about it. Political system, broken. Republican Party, deeply conservative version of oligarchic rule, obsessed with reproducing the power of the 1%. The Democratic Party, neoliberal version of oligarchic rule, both parties tied to Wall Street, both parties tied to corporate plutocrats. And that becomes the scope of the dialogue. So people think, oh, Barack Obama, he's left. What is your definition of left? No, he's centrist. He's got Tim Geithner, straight out of Wall Street. Chief of Staff, Jacob Lew, straight out of Citibank, or Citigroup. Where is the talk about poor people? 13,000 lobbyists targeting every congressman and woman. How many of those lobbyists for poor people? One, Marion Wright Edelman, Children's Defense Fund. Very little money. No accident that the political system is broken and reinforced in its brokenness every day now with the super PACs as a result of the citizens. The decision of the Supreme Court linked to the unleashing of corporate oligarchic plutocratic money. We are in very deep trouble. And I know you all are kind enough oftentimes to keep track of what's going on across the border, because you're right next to the empire. And we cast a hell of a shadow over Canada. Sometimes excessively so. We even got conservatives here who support single-payer health care. Wow. We say that in America. They say, you're a communist. I say, no, I'm a Christian trying to love poor folk. They out of access to health care. I know some conservatives in Canada who agree with me. For a moment. Don't know how long. But the historical specificity of the two various democratic experiments and imperial experiments are real. And we learn from each other. One of the reasons, of course, I'm here is that I'm going to take good time to learn and listen from your Canadian experience with poor folk and black folk, and brown folk and Asian folk in Canada have to say about solidarity, given my vantage point, which comes from the inside of the belly of the beast, the USA. When I say belly of the beast, I'm not demonizing the United States. I'm often accused of being anti-American. I say I've been in the United States for 13 generations. My folk helped build the nation. I'm anti-injustice in America. I'm not anti-American. Take a bullet from Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, and Bruce Springsteen, too, at least a bullet in the arm, maybe not in the heart. I love Brother Bruce. Love you, Bruce. Love you, Bruce. But the point is, Socratic energy unleashed. And that's what's happening among young people these days. It's a beautiful thing to witness. But the challenge is, will it be connected to the legacy, or the best of the legacy of Jerusalem? By legacy of Jerusalem, I'm not just talking about a religious tradition. I'm talking about a definition of what it means to be human. That says to be human is to spread hesed, loving kindness to the orphan, the widow, the weak, the vulnerable, the poor, the fatherless, the motherless. It is a prophetic orientation. You don't have to be religious to understand the moral and spiritual power of that orientation. We're talking about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel just earlier, his great work on the prophets. And what it really means to say that I will look at the world through the lens of oppressed peoples, no matter where they are. Go to the Middle East, you see Israeli occupation, you have to raise your voice because occupation is wrong, it's immoral, it's unjust. Anything to do with being anti-Semitic against precious Jewish brothers and sisters. If Jews were under occupation by Palestinians, you would raise your voice at the same level of intensity against the Palestinian occupation, but it happens to be an Israeli occupation. Occupation is wrong, no matter who it is. U.S. occupation of Afghanistan, this very moment, raise one's voice. Iraq in the past, raise one's voice. The occupation of North America vis-a-vis indigenous peoples might not have tremendous efficacy at the moment. The moral and spiritual issue is raising your voice. That's the legacy of Jerusalem. And yes, we've had prophetic voices heard in various parts of the world, in Asia, in Africa, and so forth. But our Jewish brothers and sisters provided this magnificent gift of a whole battalion of prophetic voices of Amos and Isaiah and Micah and the others. You're going to see it this Friday night at Passover, talking about Jonah. Wow, that's going to be very difficult for many Jewish brothers and sisters, talking about being enslaved if you're highly successful. That's a leap of imagination, but it's possible. Imperative. It can be done. Yet it's unsettling. That's the way it ought to be. That's precisely the way it ought to be. And the fascinating thing, actually, when you juxtapose Socrates with the legacy of Jerusalem, you know, Socrates never cries, he never sheds a tear. All of the depictions of Socrates, of course, he never wrote a word. I don't want students here to imitate Socrates in that regard. But he never cries, he never sheds a tear. Whereas the Legacy of Jerusalem begins with tears, cries of affliction. Begins with wails, not whines. Bob Marley and the Wailers, not the whiners. Part of his Jamaican genius. You wail, you're calling for help against the backdrop of catastrophe. A catastrophe visited on the people. And to begin to come to terms with the legacy of Jerusalem that leads toward the kind of solidarity we need to enact today is to be unashamed of shedding tears, because anyone, including Socrates, who goes through life and never sheds a tear never really loves concrete persons. Can love abstract principles or even wisdom in a detached manner. But when you deeply love, you're going to cry. Like at the coffin of your loved ones, a betrayal. And one of the great contributions of the best of the cultures of oppressed people is keeping it real enough to connect critical Socratic energy with tears that signify newness, looking for alternative, and taking a risk and being vulnerable enough to cry. And to connect that cry to straightening your back up and willingness to fight, but always putting catastrophe, forms of death at the center of one's analysis. Part of the problem in the United States is that the United States itself began as a death-denying, death-dodging, death-ducking civilization, obsessed with innocence. So you look at the U.S. Constitution, there's no reference to the institution of white supremacist slavery. There's no reference to the institution of imperial subjugation of indigenous people. They call savages, and the only reference to black folks slave trade ending in 1807, and 3/5 of the person. No reference to the institution. 22% of the inhabitants of the United States, enslaved Africans, their labor generates the wealth that is the precondition of any talk about democracy by founding fathers, most of whom were slaveholders. And you think that sooner or later chickens won't come home to roost. You think sooner or later you're not going to reap what you sow. You're going to end up fighting a barbaric civil war of 620,000 dead over an institution not invoked in your Constitution. Death dodging, truth dodging. Condition of truth allows suffering to speak. Truth crushed to earth, rises again. What's in the wash gonna come out in the rinse. Sooner or later, you're gonna have to come to terms with your greed. You're gonna have to come to terms with your avarice. You're gonna have to come to terms with your narrowness, your parochialism, and your provincialism. How long do you think you can live on lies? Trying to be clear. Trying to be candid, trying to be frank. And it's precisely the prophetic tradition and the Socratic tradition of the past of all of our various national experiments that tried to tell the truth of those who were suffering. You're going to lose the best of what you got if you don't come to terms with the suffering that you wrought. Solidarity has to do with the willingness to work alongside. And in fact, I would go even more radically. I think Brother Bernie would agree with me. To actually fall in love with poor people and working people, gay brothers and lesbian sisters, black folk catching hell, brown and yellow and red folk catching hell, white brothers and sisters, working classes being crushed by bosses, trade unions being marginalized by capital, It is a question of a steadfast commitment to the well-being of others. That's what love is. That's why Brother Martin used to say justice is what love looks like in public. It spills over. Because when you really love the children, you can't stand the fact that they don't have enough to eat. They're going to decrepit schools and dilapidated housing. When you really love working people, you can't stand the fact that they don't have jobs with a living wage and are being treated with dignity at the workplace. When you really love black folk, you can't stand the fact that all of this trigger-happy policing that happens week in and week out. And our dear brother Trayvon Martin is just the peak of an iceberg. It's happening every week in the United States. Every week in the United States. Marley Graham in the Bronx. 2 in Detroit. What about our Iraqi sister? Killed by vigilante citizens. El Cajon, California. We can go on and on and on. Arbitrary police power, arbitrary judicial power, arbitrary power, citizens over other citizens engaged in vicious violence. Sometimes it's black on black. Sometimes it's black on white. Sometimes it's black on brown. All of it be radically called into question, but all of it in so many ways too. A matter of poor people turning on each other rather than organizing, mobilizing. It's so easy to scapegoat the most vulnerable. So much of discourse and immigration policy in the United States, so deeply racist, has to do with scapegoating the most vulnerable, the new immigrants, disproportionately Latino, rather than confronting the most powerful. The business class that wants them there to exploit them. Let's engage in the structural analysis too when it comes to the ways in which poor people pitted against each other. Black poor against white poor. Brown poor against yellow poor. Working people pitted against each other. And it usually happens about once a generation. And in the United States, sometimes even longer, because the level of seduction in the States, of course, is just so thick. The last thing in the United States, the powers that be imagine, would be people organizing like the Occupy movement. That's why they laughed at the Occupy movement. I was blessed to be there at the beginning of the second week. We were talking about, maybe we could move to Atlanta and Seattle. That was utopian. We were just fighting just for the space in Occupy. Lo and behold, look what happened. Spread like a wildfire. Young folk hungry and thirsty. Looking around at their university, student debt higher than credit card debt in the United States. Locked into economic bondage for 10, 15, 20 years with loans and still wondering whether they would get a job. The university itself more and more corporatized, commercialized, commodified, hard to get critical reflection. Students viewed as consumers rather than citizens in the making. That's that deep education versus cheap schooling I was talking about. Cheap schooling tied to the market model of education. Get through, give me your money, okay, got your skill, go and get your job and be glad you graduated. Be glad you got a degree, because so many of your fellow young people don't have a degree at all and they locked into the underground economy. And see, in the United States with the new Jim Crow, you all tell me about Canada, where the underground economy has been operating for the last 40 years. We've gone from 300,000 folk in prison to 2.5 million today. We have invested $1/2 trillion, a Marshall Plan, a carceral penal Marshall Plan in jails, prisons, and criminal justice system. And yet when it comes to education, not only can't find a penny, you got to cut it. Come to housing, you can't find a penny, no, you got to cut it. Healthcare, you got to cut it. Warped priorities, more and more young folk locked into the underbelly of capitalist globalization, which is what? The trafficking in children, sex slaves, drugs, arms, guns in the hood, armament, when it comes to nation states all around the world. $1.6 trillion spent last year on armaments. United States bought 43%. That's what it is to be the major empire of the moment. We won't even talk about the drones that are being dropped on innocent civilians in Pakistan, and Yemen, and other places, killing cousins and daughters and sons of would-be terrorists. We can argue about whether we should engage in various kinds of warlike activity against terrorists, but to kill their daughters and sons is collective punishment. And for me, that's immoral. More and more voices in the United States being raised. I was just in court a week ago today with Brother Chris Hedges and the others wrestling with the National Defense Authorization Act. I know a number of you all follow what's going on, Section 1021 and 1022. The executive branch now has the right to detain without due process, without judicial process, U.S. citizens who they define as being in relation to terrorist groups. And the president now has the power to assassinate and murder U.S. citizens here in the United States or abroad when the president decides that that person is hostile to the interests of the United States. We already had 3 U.S. citizens killed in the Middle East. That's authoritarian. That's a move toward crypto-fascism. That's serious business. Very serious business. Under that particular law, I wouldn't be able to get back into the country. I like Canada, you know. It gets a little cold here in the wintertime, but I wouldn't be able to get back into the country after trying to tell the truth. But I'm one of the plaintiffs, which means we're willing to go to jail. Because when it becomes that authoritarian and that crypto-fascist, if you don't take a stand symbolically and literally, it becomes normalized. Just like the Patriotic Act in the United States. It becomes normalized. Erosion of rights and liberties. Trying to do what? Keep people so fearful and intimidated. Keep them scared. You don't really want to take a stand. And the alternative is what? To feed into a culture of spiritual malnutrition, emptiness of soul, moral constipation. Folk have a sense of what's right is just stuck and it won't come out. It won't flow. Because they're scared. Too much greed, too much avarice, too much fear, too much envy, too much jealousy. That's where we are today. And yet here, King's University College, you all say, no, we're going to fight back. We are going to fight back. We're going to engage in Socratic courage and think critically. We're going to engage in prophetic witness. We might be secular, atheistic, and agnostic brothers and sisters. We may be Muslim, prophetic Muslims. We may be Jews, prophetic Jews. We may be Christians, prophetic Christians. We may be anarchists. I love my anarchist brothers and sisters. They teach us to keep track, the concentrated power of the nation state. They're right about that. Nation states can easily become and often are authoritarian. We learn from our libertarian brothers and sisters, have a deep commitment to precious rights and liberties. Communist brothers and sisters, I love my communist brothers and sisters. They teach us what? Unaccountable power in the private sector, monopolies and oligopolies in the economy that need to be decentralized and democratized in the name of the dignity of working people. But of course, in the end, I'm neither anarchistic, communist, or any ism. I'm just trying to be a decent person in the move from womb to tomb, to think in solidarity with people who are struggling here in the States, in every corner of the globe, and say, I am delighted with great joy. I find joy in trying to serve others, joy in trying to speak whatever truths I can speak in solidarity with various social movements around the world, and working with progressive politicians on the inside of our broken political systems, because there's still a role for inside progressives, even though they are very, very few these days in the States. You all tell me how many you got in Canada. I'm sure you have more than we do, indeed. Last note before I stop. I started on a Socratic note. I want to end on a blue note. Because I want to tell young folk that if you're really serious about this life of struggle, that you have to be a blues woman or a blues man. What do you mean, Brother West? Ralph Waldo Ellison, one of the great literary giants of the 20th century, wrote a novel called Invisible Man. And he used to say the blues ain't nothing but an autobiographical chronicle of a personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. So when B.B. King says, nobody loves me but my mama, she might be jiving too. That's the blues. That's catastrophic. Billie Holiday sang Strange Fruit, the Southern Trees Bare. You all know that song. She's talking about something catastrophic. She's talking about American terrorism, Jim Crow and Jane Crow, and lynching every 2.5 days for 50 years. Some black child, a black woman, or black man hanging from some tree in American apartheid. That's catastrophic. That's why there's no such thing as a Negro problem or black problem. That's true in America, it's true in Canada. No such thing as a black problem in Canada. No, catastrophe is being visited on black people. No such thing as a woman's problem. No, catastrophe is being visited on women. It's only a problem from the normative gaze of the mainstream. From that perspective, oh, we got a problem, they're a threat. But from the perspective of the folk who's suffering, this is catastrophic, not problematic. And the blues always has an intimate connection to catastrophe. Starts with catastrophe, but the response is compassion. A compassion that is so deep that you become a long-distance runner. That's why Emmett Till's mother is really the model. It ought to be the model for young folk talking about solidarity. You all know the story about Emmett Till, our dear brother who was killed by cowardly American terrorists, cowardly white supremacists. In that bucket, Jim Crow, Mississippi, the summer of 1955, 14 years old. Was killed, dropped him in the Tallahatchie River. And his mother said, we're going to bring him back to Chicago. Looked for 5 days, found the body in Tallahatchie River, brought it back to Chicago, kept the casket open so the whole world could see. The president, mayor, city council said, close the casket. She said, no, we're going to keep this casket open. He was my only baby. His father fought in the Jim Crow army against a gangster named Hitler. We're going to keep this open. And when she stepped to the lectern, after 50,000 people had marched through Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ in Chicago, it was the first massive, solidaristic civil rights demonstration in the United States in almost 30 years, 3 months before Rosa Parks sat down on the bus known to Stand Up for Justice. And Martin Luther King Jr. and Ian Dixon and others didn't come together. It was that death that was the catalyst. It's one reason why people are talking about Trayvon Martin in the way that they are. Is he like Emmett Till these days in the States? We shall see. But when Mrs. Till, or Sister Mamie, stepped to the lectern and looked over and saw her baby, she had Socratic energy and courage. I got some questions about systems of oppression. And she had a legacy of Jerusalem deep down in her soul that said, I know the difference between justice and revenge. So when she stepped forward, what did she say? She said, I don't have a minute to hate. I will pursue justice for the rest of my life. And I will be in solidarity with all who suffer, because I connect my suffering tied to my baby with the suffering of all mothers and all fathers and all brothers and all sisters of all colors, every corner of the globe. In my own way, I stand with them. That's a sublime moment in which Socratic legacy and the prophetic legacy come together, but she's a blues sister. Because even as she said it with the tears, with all of the hurt, she still had a smile on her face, because she was determined that solidarity would become for her, as it was, a way of life. And when she died in 2005, people talked about how she sustained her witness. A blues woman responding to American terrorism, embracing, inclusive, but always rooted, R-O-O-T-E. So then the R-O-U-T-E-S, the routes that she took, had genuine substance in the solidarity that she enacted. Thank you all so very much. We'll have a good time. Thank you so very much.
Well, hello. My name is Mishka. I'm a fourth-year student studying social justice and peace. I just want to say thank you again so much for coming. I really enjoyed every word of what you just said.
Thank you so very much. I'm the one blessed, I think.
I have a question about nonviolence, and it's something very close to my heart, being a firm believer in the power of nonviolence. And you talked earlier about the idea of the necessity of death in order for there to be rebirth. And I'm just wondering about what that death should look like. And there's a lot of people that believe that violence is necessary in that death. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that. And how can we as people tell the difference between this necessity of violence in the face of occupation and oppression and the difference between that and simply reaffirming a narrative of violence and the dangers of that?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Good God, we could have a seminar on that. That's complicated, but thank you so very much. I think anytime we talk about violence, though, we have to begin with the forms of violence already operating in the lives of people, especially poor and working people. Extreme case, police power. Innocent death. Violence at the workplace. Not just discrimination, but chronic disrespect, where your whole life becomes a perpetual audition. This has been so true for people of color and women and so forth, in deeply racist and patriarchal spaces. That's a kind of violence that takes place, you see. The kind of decrepit education that commits a kind of soul murder on young people. It's another kind of violence. So even before we get into violence as a political strategy or tactic, you already have forms of violence. Oh, you already have you already have forms of violence that people have to contend with every day of their lives. Now, I believe, both as Christian and deep Democrat, that one of the aims of Socratic and prophetic witness is to try to break the cycle of all of these kinds of violences tied to structures of domination. And the best way of doing that is have an explicit love ethic that tries to stay in contact with the humanity of the folk who themselves are doing the gangsterizing. Themselves who are doing or committing, targeting folk with violence. And that's why I have such great respect for Martin King and Desmond Tutu, Dorothy Day and the others. but I'm not a pacifist. So I have great respect for the pacifist tradition, but I'm not a pacifist. I have a very, very narrow conception of circumstances under which just war is permissible. So I would have fought against Hitler, that gangster. If he had won, we'd always speak in German, I wouldn't be here, probably a lot of you wouldn't be here. In that case, you had to go to war. If I was in South Africa, I would have joined the Spirit Nation with Nelson Mandela. That was part of the struggle that we had with the lawyers the other day. Because Nelson Mandela was on the U.S. terrorist list for 20-some years. And many of us were in deep solidarity with his movement. So under this law, we could be detained without trial. Because we would say explicitly, nothing is standing in the way with our solidarity with Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and the struggle of the ANC against apartheid. We go to jail for that. We just think we shouldn't have to go to jail. We ought to have rights to express our views in this regard, you see. So that in that sense, I'm very close to the pacifist tradition that talks about both the intrinsic quality as well as the effects of nonviolent resistance. And I think we must pursue all forms of nonviolent resistance, and under very, very stringent conditions would there be just war, in my case, which would be joining some kind of group that engaged in the kind of counter-violence. I wouldn't call it counter-terror only because for me, I would always want to be explicit about the moral and immoral aspects of the very violence I would commit. So that there's a tragic element in the counter-violence against the violence coming at the ANC forces that the Nazis were fighting. It could be Jews, communists, gays, whoever it is, black folk, whatever. Various armed forces trying to push out fascists like Hitler and like Franco and others. But that's the beginning of an answer to your question, though. I know you all have magnificent questions with Brother Bernie and the other here wrestling with that. Is it just one microphone or two? Just one. Okay, that's good.
It's a real honor to hear you speak tonight, Dr. West.
Oh, well, thank you, my brother.
Actually, that was a great question that Mr. asked. I was actually thinking of a book that's a great refuge for me in nonviolent action is The Raft is Not the Shore, conversation between Thich Nhat Hanh and Daniel Berrigan. And actually, one point in the book, Daniel Berrigan in the 70s, he's talking to Thich Nhat Hanh, prepares the peace talks, and he's referring to how hard it is to get nonviolent philosophy to students in North American campuses. Of course, it's the 70s. But Berrigan speaks of how he talked to a Canadian university once, and they called him literally a coward for not using violence or, for speaking in favor of nonviolence. Something recently I've experienced as an activist in the movements here in the last few years is actually a language that's called violence baiting, and where it says that when we discuss how we will approach our tactics in the movement or in struggle, that we won't engage in violence baiting, so we won't have a discussion whether or not there will be a use of violence or not, which has, in my opinion, led to a lot of problematic situations. A lot of good organizers who don't mean to be involved in such things finding a lot more prosecution by the police because of this confusion sometimes. Anyways, I just wanted to ask your thoughts a bit more on that. I know that you had spoke on that, but to me it seems like it's kept me away personally because you can't have this conversation of even what is our overall. You need to have some trust with each other to have solidarity to some extent. And when you see sometimes how it goes in the streets, I don't want to ever take away anyone's reason for being there, but I want to feel that if I'm going to be involved in nonviolent actions, that's not going to be jeopardized. And I think that's a true meaning of solidarity. And if there's a real diversity of tactics, then there would be respect for nonviolent actions.
Absolutely. Oh, no, I agree with you 100% there. First, let me say, anybody who would call the Berrigan cowards don't understand what it really means to be a freedom fighter who goes to jail over and over and over again and comes out fighting decade after decade after decade. That's the highest level of courage. That's just a very mistaken way of putting forward a disagreement about a strategy. And of course, we can disagree on strategy. You have to acknowledge the integrity and the courage of Berrigan-like figures in that regard, you see. Second, I mean, part of our challenge anytime you're talking about movements in the United States is the, not just a disagreement, inability to learn how to agree to disagree and still be in solidarity, but there's just so many spies and forms of infiltration in the movement. And you see, coming out of the Black Freedom Movement, of course, this has always been a fundamental problem. You know, when Martin Luther King finds out that his photographer for the last 13 years of his life with him every day was the FBI agent. He's calling the agent every day. Or when Malcolm X is dead and giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and it's one of them, the FBI agent. The level of infiltration is such that this kind of violent baiting could easily be a way of reinforcing the kind of divide and conquer and division rather than having the kind of robust democratic discussion in which we agree to disagree. Now, I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that every instance of violent baiting is tied to the FBI, CIA. What would be the FBI equivalent in Canada? It's called what? CSIS. Absolutely. And we, you know, probably got some CSIS folk here. Hey, love you. Happy Holy Week, you know what I mean? But that's always one element as well. But if that is the case where you find yourself unable to operate, then in that regard, you do have to form your own organization and coalesce when coalition is possible and not coalesce under other conditions. That's nothing wrong with that either. Absolutely. The important thing is to keep your fire.
Diversity in the movement is a good thing.
Oh, Lord, yes. Mediated with respect. And as I say, willingness to agree to disagree and also to accept the agreement. All in the Occupy movement, for the most part, say corporate greed, wealth inequality must be radically called into question. You got a whole lot of folk who agree with that. Progressive liberals, anarchists, communists, socialists, pink, red, black nationalists, right across the board. Brown activists, indigenous people and so forth. Then you come up, well, what does the vision of the new society look like? Well, then you got another conversation. It's fascinating. Just go right ahead.
Hi there.
How you doing?
I'm Anthony. I've been part of the local Occupy movement.
Yeah.
And also like a longtime anarchist organizer and really seen the momentum and the attention that this movement's brought
Yeah.
to some of those principles.
Yeah.
And so I guess really what I'm thinking is with spring, our early spring that's come on us, a lot of people are eager to see where this is going. Like whether people are going to be going back to the parks or whether there's some new phase that's taking shape. And I know some of the other prominent people, like I know Chomsky and others have talked about, you know, we really need to move past the park and start implementing real work and building towards another phase. And I'm just curious what you might say to all that, like where this is going from here.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I salute the work that you've already done too, though, brother. But one, I would want to argue first that what has happened already constitutes a kind of real work. I would reject the language of the real work happens now, as if bringing to world consciousness corporate greed and so forth was not real work. Especially all the folk who went to jail, some of us went to jail a number of times. That's connected to real work, you know what I mean? At the same time, the question is, can we take it to a new level?
Maybe better said, less glamorous work.
Or less glamorous work, absolutely. Which is organizing at the grassroots level and so forth and so on, absolutely. But I don't think there's just one model or one plan. And here, I think I do agree with decentralized models. I don't see one overarching organization that dictates what the real model would be. Some of us are spending a lot of time on the general strike, May 1. That's going to be difficult. I'm with them. You see, some would say, no, it's premature. Okay, I can understand, but we're still going with it. Others would say, well, we need to do the quiet grassroots organizing that we build over 2 or 3 years. I say, well, no, we need some presence in the public imagination so that persons do not think that somehow this was just a uprising that is now petered out. So you need some public presence, including some presence in the media without one becoming co-opted by either the Democratic Party or other liberal and neoliberal institutions, but still being willing to engage them. It's not a question of just at a distance. I think we still, as I said before, there's still going to be some voices within, let's say, the neoliberal Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders and Keith Ellison and Steve Cohen and some of the other progressive liberals who can actually be allies on certain issues at times. And then, of course, we disagree on other issues, especially foreign policy. But I don't have a blueprint at all in terms of what the movement as a whole ought to do. Most importantly, though, we have to dedicate ourselves to going back to whatever forms of activism we were doing either before or at a different level. There is a sense in which during the winter, a number of us had to do a number of different things that was not only less visible, but also was not as explicit and direct. In this spring, we've got to come back strong, and I'm convinced we are. You know, we in the States, we've got a number of very powerful events that are in the making. Very much so. Yes, thank you so much. Just go right ahead, my dear sister.
Hi, my name is Borson. I really enjoyed your talk. I really appreciated that, so thank you. But one thing that really struck me was when you were talking about the unexamined life and how the unexamined life is not worth living. And you know, naive me, I always thought that it would be the examined life that would cause anxiety, and because you're going to have to, I mean, in order to cultivate your interiority, that's going to cause a lot of pain, and there's going to be a lot of suffering. It's inevitable, but. I mean, I'm turning 22 tomorrow, and people are just like, oh my God, that's so old. Do you feel old? I'm not. I mean, I do now, I suppose, but I mean, I'm okay with just moving on, and time happens whether we like it or not. And it all depends on what you're doing with your time. But now I'm starting to realize that even the unexamined life causes anxiety. And I just want to know what your thoughts was, because it seems like either or.
Oh,
and I'm saying this from a perspective as someone who sees us all kind of moving towards regretting the day we were born, which really scares me. I mean, it might be funny, but it's actually kind of scary to me. I mean, before, death used to just be the end. Birth was the beginning, death was the end, but now death is this tragedy that we're trying to prolong, but we're prolonging something but not doing anything during that life, but we're prolonging death, and it doesn't make sense to me. I don't know why that really causes anxiety.
Yeah, you got a lot there in that question. I appreciate it. So heartfelt and so clear and eloquent. Well, the Socratic claim was that the unexamined life is not worth living, meaning that it's a form of walking death, not to muster the courage to critically reflect on who you are and what it means to be human. And then, like I said, Jerusalem says, in relation to the least of these, in relation to the weak and the vulnerable and so forth. Because you can be Socratic and still just end up critically examining things but not concerned about other people's suffering. So you make that connection so that the solidarity tied to struggle makes a difference. But there's no doubt, when I said the examined life is painful, I could have said anxiety-ridden, sometimes melancholic, sometimes lonely, not just solitudinal, lonely. That's part of what it means to be human too. Yes. And I think that that's when I talk about courage, when you wrestle with those things, you come out with more strength, more determination, more fortitude in that sense, you see. But you want to do it not just by yourself, but connected with others. Conversation with the dead, horizontal connections with the living, intellectual, political, spiritual, moral, and so forth. And happy birthday tomorrow. Oh, you have a good one. You don't have a Socratic birthday. Socratic birthday, that's what we say.
Hi, my name is Arthur. I'm an engineering student. First of all, thank you for your speech. It was really moving.
Thank you.
The facts and the ideas that you mentioned are really moving. Particularly at the beginning of your speech, you said that capitalism kind of like devalues love. Just kind of like vaguely he said that, and also later in your speech you mentioned anarchy and communism being, you know, like there are some kind of, like, you kind of endorse some of the ideology, some of the ideas within it. I was wondering if you are, I guess, if that's kind of a bit of, if you're suggesting that that's a solution, like seeing how, like, you know, the title of the speech is Breaking Shackles of Capitalism, and if that's not your suggestion for a solution, then just a little bit of your thoughts of what is.
Yes, that I appreciate you read me right, though. Because I was talking about how capitalism devalues non-market values, of which love is a major one, but there's other ones too. There's friendship, there's trust, vulnerability, all the things. So if market price becomes the fundamental criteria that determines human value, then you end up with a world of survival of the slickest, obsession with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. And it's thoroughgoing social Darwinism, in that sense. And that to me is a form of just spiritual emptiness. That's the kind of world we live in. So yes, what has been significant about the anarchist and communist movement, socialist movements, and a variety of others, prophetic religion, is they're tied to non-market values. And the question then becomes, how do we transform a whole economic system, domestic and global, that pushes non-market values to the edge? And what does that new system look like? I don't think any of us knows exactly what it looks like. I mean, I've been a member of Democratic Socialists of America for over 30 years, going back to the legacy of Michael Harrington and others, but I've always had deep disagreements with most of my comrades there because I'm Socratic, right? Meaning what? Meaning that, well, then socialism becomes actually a signifier of how do we come together and think about creating a kind of economic system in which people can live lives of decency and the weak and vulnerable are not crushed by the powerful. And democratic mechanisms of accountability at the workplace. There's a wonderful book coming out by Rick Wolff called Democracy at Work. And he's talking about democracy at the workplace. And there's elective affinities to some language of radical Democrats, socialists, anarchists, and so forth, going back to Pannekoek and Gorder and Luxemburg and the others, workers' councils and so forth and so on. Councils without Bolsheviks, see, that's my tradition. And they were crushed by Lenin, right? Because he wanted Bolsheviks, he wanted a professional revolution, and oh, we want the workers to run the thing themselves, we don't need help from the new elites, from the Communist Party. Well, then you got a fascinating debate on the left. Workers' councils versus communist parties. That was part of the dialogue I had with Brother Hugo Chavez. I'm just being honest, but this is my tradition, Brother Hugo. Tell me yours. See what I mean? So what does it look like? It is beyond capitalism, I know that. It's got to be democratic, you got to have rights and liberties. Can I give up a blueprint? No, not really. It has to be part of the conversation. Yeah, I'm sorry, go on.
My name's Jeff Hanks. I think I have the same question that you just talked about with that gentleman. So how do we switch from an economy based on war and exploitation of 99% to one based on building social capital and quality of life for all? How can all of us in this room help work towards this transformation, or what can we do to enhance the change from what we're doing now to a new global economy that helps and enriches all our lives?
Yeah, but again, you're right, though. I mean, in so many ways, that's the $64,000 question. I think the kind of transformation that I'm talking about rarely takes place in one generation. That's why I was talking about long-distance running. I was talking about traditions of remembrance, traditions of resistance, kind of thing Walter Benjamin and others have talked about with great insight, you see. And that means then we have to be organized. We have to be part of some institution or organization that is committed to that long-term transformation in our short lives. You know. Well, I think you probably live longer than I will, but I mean 65, 70, 75, 80, and then pass that on. And who knows? You know, you never know when the transformation might take place, but in our lives, we just have to bear witness to say, this is the stand I want to take. This is the kind of society I want to fight for. and be part of an organization that does that. Yeah, good luck.
Hi, Cornel. My name is Brent. As a citizen of the United States, how do you feel in regards to the foreign policymakers of your country blocking a woman from Africa from becoming the president of the World Bank? And do you feel if she is elected, she would be able to change the neo-colonial actions of the World Bank?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I don't have a lot of expectations of the World Bank. I just don't. You know what I mean? I mean, the World Bank is under the aegis of U.S. imperial elite who run the empire. You know what I mean? Now, on the other hand, you know, they had to take a choice between that sister and Larry Summers. Of course, I go with this sister. Or Jeffrey Sachs was running, right? He's undergone a magnificent transformation, hasn't he? From the old neoliberal days to very progressive days. He would be a very important voice, but it would still be under the aegis. So that's what I'm not saying that the choice is unimportant. It's just that I would say yes, and then I would go on with a critique of the World Bank, even when she took it over.
Yeah, it wouldn't make that big of a difference
It wouldn't
in
make
terms of the total power.
Yeah, exactly. But still, we have to fight for individual choice. In the same way, people in the stage can argue, well, what's the difference between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney? See, they both run the empire, they both tie the oligarchy rule. Of course, Brother Barack at least tries at times to every once in a while put his foot on the emergency when it comes to complete wipeout of social network for poor people. On the other hand, on foreign policy, you know, under Bush, 44 drones, under Barack Obama, 239. Worse. But under Romney, 750. You know what I mean? So then you make a practical judgment. But in making a practical judgment, you still recognize you're dealing with a system. Not just individuals, you're dealing with a larger system. And that's why I made that point about last year it was 93% of the income growth went to the top 1%. That's under Brother Barack. But that's probably tied to the fact that they did not make a priority in terms of talking about poor and working people. Just read it, but good to see.
Hi, my name is Oyen. I just have a quick question. Earlier you spoke about having a passion for speaking up when it comes to injustice, no matter the situation that you're in.
Yeah.
And just something that crossed my mind was there are so many circumstances that present themselves as worthy battles, but then there's also the mindset of picking your battles.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I guess the question that I'm trying to ask is, when do you speak up? Do you speak up all the time? And not just that, how do you do it in a way that you aren't spread out so thin and you don't get labored and brought down by so many cumbersome issues?
Yeah, ooh, that's a profound question, though, because it's a question of wise judgment. Because you got one life to live. If someone asked me to speak out the day I'm giving the eulogy of my grandmother, what you think I'm going to do? There could be revolution happening that very moment. I say, somebody else got to take over. Grandma helped raise me, y'all. Oh, Professor West, you got to be fundamentally committed to the revolution. You got to let Grandma go. Not this, brother, no. No. I know where it all comes from. I have to make a practical judgment, right? And people have to trust enough in yourself and myself to say, I wish I could speak out all the time, but I can't speak out all the time because I'm a finite human being who's mama's child, daddy, kid, grandma's loved one. And you have to balance that. I mean, let alone by the time you get my age, you got a grandson. I got to keep track of that, little brother. Sure, police shoot him down in a minute. It's like Trayvon. I got a daughter, I got a son, you know what I mean? So how do I balance all that? Well, wise judgment. Where does wise judgment come from? Dialogue with folks like yourself and others to get me to think about how can I balance this in such a way that I want to be true to who I am, but who I am is not just one thing. I don't have just one identity. Freedom fighter. Dad, granddad, brother, got two sisters, and so forth and so on. And you had to balance that. And there's no formula or algorithm that you can appeal to is what Aristotle called phronesis, practical wisdom. So you're in conversation. Well, do you think I should be to your close partner? You think I should speak out on this? Well, if you don't study tonight, you're not going to pass that exam. Maybe the next major demonstration, you give the keynote, but study that night. See what I mean? And don't feel guilty about it. Because the only way in which one feels as if one's presence is necessary in every moment, in every instance, is the conception of oneself as Messiah. And that's a self-deception. No one of us are messiahs. And if you are, learn how to die in order to live more maturely and come to terms with who you are. But your question is one of the, as you know, I can't answer it concretely, but it's a matter of trying to get that balance in place. That's the crucial thing. That's the beautiful thing. Yes?
Last two questions, please make it quick.
No, you got to be out of the room by 9 o'clock. No, just take your time then.
Hi, Dr. West.
How you doing?
I would like to draw on your wisdom as a teacher.
Yeah.
Because I feel like we have these public spaces, like in parks or libraries, very few public spaces left, and they're flawed, but they're very precious. And I'm wondering if you can expand a bit on this idea of deep education versus cheap schooling in a way, because sometimes it feels like education is becoming just another thing that you buy, and people don't feel very engaged. They're not really interested in learning. Maybe this is just my perspective. But how, in your experience, have you awakened critical thought and engagement in young people who maybe otherwise are just kind of here to get the piece of paper?
Yeah, I appreciate that. What has happened, I think, in so much of modern education is not just that market model, but an obsession with competition, individual choice, tied to narrow economic conceptions of upward mobility, with no serious spiritual, critical, historical, and political reflection. The democratic model, the deep democratic model, in Finland, I think, is a useful place to begin. You know, Finland's #1 in the world in math and science.
I lived there for 6 years.
Oh, so you know what I'm talking about. Absolutely. It's a whole culture of equity and shared responsibility. It's one in which not just teachers, but critical reflection has a gravitas that's not reducible just to cost-benefit analysis. It's not reducible to how much money it generates. I mean, in America, you know, we reached a point in America where, as my brother says, if something doesn't make money, it doesn't make sense to people. There's something spiritually vacuous and morally empty about that, you see. And so in education, you say, well, I see that you're teaching Toni Morrison and Shakespeare and Sophocles. What does it translate in terms of how much money I'll make on the job? Well, it's not really like that. We're talking about life and death. We're not talking about cost benefit. What kind of human being you want to be. You see. Listen to John Coltrane, to Beethoven, to Sarah Vaughan. It's not going to translate necessarily into a better job. But if you go through life and miss out on it, you're going to really miss something. Really, really miss something. And that's just one example. It could be in contemporary form, Erykah Badu, Lupe, whatever. Folks trying to be critical. You see them? And so the question becomes then, how do we somehow try to point to and enact a culture of education, deep education, paideia, of equity, shared responsibility, critical reflection, elevating teachers, ideas, and not reducing it simply to race to the top, to use the language of the U.S. Department of Education. Education is not a race, it's a right. And it's a responsibility. And it requires that courage that I was alluding to earlier. And it requires actually, you know, in the United States for so long, the top graduates have gone into investment banking because 42% of the profits now in the United States go to banks. 25 years ago, it was about 9%. We've seen the financialization of monopoly capitalism. So big banks now, you see. So the young kids go straight where the money is. You see. That's one reason why you end up with a lot of very smart folk in banking, even though their souls oftentimes are relatively empty. But you end up in the political class with undeniable mediocrity. That's what the Republican primary has been all about. Just undeniable, massive, across the board mediocrity. You know what I'm talking about, ambassadors. But in Finland, teachers taken so seriously, those do very well become teachers, not investment bankers. Reflected in salary, respected in status. Now, how can we create visions of education, deep democratic model of education that tilt toward that production of a citizen rather than consumer, which is part of the market model of education? Beginning with not just K, 0 through 6, because we know the first 6 years of young people, very, very important. And I should add as a footnote, in the United States, when it comes to just test scores, the top 1% of the United States do better than Finland. And Finland's number 1 in the world. Why is that? Because the top 1% go to prep schools, private schools, very targeted public schools where small classrooms, quality teachers, administrators, parents who care, and students being told every week, you're brilliant. Whether it's true or not, you're brilliant, you're brilliant, you're brilliant. That self-confidence and self-respect that's necessary for any serious educational exploration. That's what happens in Finland too. You see, you're brilliant. No, but so-and-so did better than me. No, you got your own kind of brilliance. Oh yeah, that makes sense. It's almost the opposite in the States oftentimes. You know what I mean? Put them down, put them down, put them down. Special education, put them aside. Disproportionately poor, disproportionately black and brown. I'm sorry, you're very patient. I'll do it for you.
Dr. West, I've really, really enjoyed your talk today. My name is Jennifer Mustafa. I'm actually a sessional instructor on campus. You started out your talk talking about the academy. You know, universities, they're broken. And I kind of agree with you. Probably means I won't get hired next year. But it just so happens actually that quite a few of my students are here, and I cannot take credit for them. Kojo Hayward, Eric Pablo, Dominic, and Michiko, our very first awesome questions. So I'm incredibly proud of them.
Absolutely.
But what that relates to is sort of my question, which very much relates to the last one. So I won't re-ask it, but it's more specifically about the university and our roles as educators within this institution and the constraints that we face, especially because of the intricacies of things like tenure track, and so on and so forth. So you said a while back in your lecture about people on the inside,
yes,
and how they're few and far between, the ones that are sort of really trying to evoke criticality. And you're old school, they're new school, I think I'm middle school. So my question to you would be, are we on the inside as educators in the academy? And if so, what are the implications of that for how we educate and how we try to walk this balance between sort of fitting in, because otherwise we're out of a job and then we can't, provoke our students and sort of advance these sorts of ideas.
Yes. Well, salute the work you're doing. Appreciate that query. Well, one, I think we are all multi-contextual, which means that there are contexts in which we're very much on the inside. Couldn't be more than inside in Princeton. Princeton is an institution of higher education for the ruling class of the American Empire. And we produce Ralph Nader and Edward Said, so we're not doing just generating Rumsfelds and George Schultz, who are also Princetonians, but Princeton, of course, like any other liberal institution, produces a number of different kinds of persons, right? Norman Thomas comes out of Princeton, one of the great American socialists. But in that context, very much on the inside. When you and I are in the street demonstrating, we're on the outside. See, I've taught in prisons for 30 years with brothers, segregated prisons. I've seen it grow over the years. In that context, it's a kind of outsider. It's an insider in an outsider situation, because you're talking about a population that's socially neglected, economically abandoned, given up on, but they're reading Plato, Augustine, Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison, Marquez, and so forth and so on. And it's fantastic engagement. We should never downplay, and this is very important, because there's a difference between the micro-social and the macro-social. When I talk about the corporatization of the university, commodification of the university, those are structural tendencies. But in terms of micro-social, I know Brother Bernie could bear witness to this. Each student is precious. And to affect the heart, mind, and soul of each student is a gift, it's a joy. So even in a corporatized university, if you're interacting with students individually and you can see criticality taking place, you jump for joy. Because no matter how you corporatize that university is, it doesn't control every moment and every relation. You see, here's Brother Hammond over here. He's got a counter-hegemonic space. And folk who know that make a dash and say, yes, we want to go. Right? Now look, you run and say, well, you know what, like Bernie Hammond, he's hegemonic at King's University. No, I wouldn't go that far. There's structural constraints that he has to work under. We wish he and his vision in Weltanschauung was pervasive, hegemonic. Everybody who came through not only was affected by him, but learned how to die and learned how to live in the way in which he talks. But no, that's not what universities do. So micro-social, individual to groups, very precious. But the structural tendencies still, oftentimes are the dominant, the hegemonic ones. So you create counter-hegemonic spaces where that kind of impact that you've had with these wonderful students does in fact take place. But I think that the contextual thing is very, in some way multi-contextualism is just as important as multiculturalism. Because you can be multicultural and still stay in the same class context, the same imperial context, and never connect with those suffering. But it's still colorful. Different cultures and so forth and so on. The music, the food, and all that good stuff. You know, the multi-contextual talking about operations of power, class, empire, and gender, and so forth and so on. You see, homophobic struggle, anti-homophobic struggles, and so forth. But I do think that it's a dark moment right now in the history of the university. But of course, that story has to be told. That story has to be told all the way back. Look at the history of the European university. Is it any accident that Nietzsche had to leave? John Stuart Mill couldn't think of teaching. That Karl Marx, forget it. Lucky to get a Ph.D. You see. So many of the great thinkers were pushed out, completely pushed out. Because they were too creative. They refused to be conformists in that regard. And so there's no accident that you find so much creativity outside of the university. This is true too in terms of the hegemony of the radio and video and recording industry too. So much of the talent now can't fit in those deals with the oligarchs, and therefore they have to go underground. See, and we had to keep track of those artists of all different colors and genders who are trying to speak their truths but can't filter through with Jay-Z and Kanye and others dominating the scene. And I'm not saying that they're not talented, but they're not the most politically courageous brothers. See what I mean? And if they do, that would be fascinating. But how long they would stay, hegemonic, is a larger question. A larger question. Thank you so much. Yes, my dear sister. Okay. Well, yeah, it's on.
Dr. West, I want to thank you for the great presentation that you gave us this evening, but at the same time, I do have a question.
Yes.
When we're historicizing our narratives, those who are oppressed and those who do deal with a lot of struggles and conflict, is it possible to build solidarity with the oppressor? Is it possible to build solidarity even though we're still in the systemic oppression that we face? Whether it be through race, or through class, or through even gender. Is it possible to build solidarity with the oppressor? and negotiate that space?
Ooh, wonderful question. I'm so glad you got a chance to raise your question. It's a courageous question too, as well as a deep one. That again, multi-contextual, depends on the context. Depends on the context. What I mean by that is this, that there are historical moments where the contradictions, the struggles, the clash is so sharp that it's nearly impossible or is impossible to bridge. I mean, fights against fascism. It's hard to conceive of being in solidarity with fascist reactionary leaders and so forth and so on. I'll give you a good example that I can envision Ron Paul and myself testifying against the National Defense Authorization Act because he's a libertarian. And he believes it. He's not manipulative. You see. So he'd come to my defense, not because I'm involved, because of his principles. And people say, oh, Brother West standing right there with Ron Paul. What a fascinating moment of solidarity. Well, you have to distinguish between solidarity and overlap. But the overlap is real. I'll stand right next to my libertarian brother because we take rights and liberties very seriously. Very seriously indeed. Now the next moment he would say, oh, Brother West, your critique of capitalism is for me barbaric, is going to lead towards serfdom, Hayek is right. I say, brother, you hallucinating, let me show you why you're wrong. But in addition, even let's say in the school situation, that you will find individuals who are willing to be in solidarity with you because of your quality of mind, because of your willingness to learn and explore and your sense of adventure. And you can learn much from professors, students with whom you have deep disagreements. Very, very much indeed. And so in that context, if you want to call that solidarity or openness or working together, absolutely. Absolutely. And you see, as a black man who has spent so much of my life reading, and especially reading canons from the West, I've tried to read more from the East and indigenous folks and so on, but I've been deeply shaped by the canons of the West. And as much as I am deeply impressed by elements in those canonical texts, most of those texts would view myself and black folk who look like me as inferior a priori. A priori, I can read David Hume and I am in a sublime condition. Because the dialogues on religion is nothing like it. I said, David Hume, you are my partner, my soulmate. Then I turned to a national character. White supremacist to the core. Come on, David, what's going on? What happened to your Socratic energy? You just reproducing the same prejudice. I thought you were learning how to die. Nope. Sorry about that, Brother West. I'm a white supremacist. 1700s. Oh, it's a long time ago. No, Diderot had a critique of white supremacy. Same time. So that's not the only excuse you can use. How then do you read critically selectively so that you have a certain kind of overlap, if not intellectual solidarity, with some of the same figures who are very much responsible ideologically and intellectually for patriarchy and white supremacy and so forth. And you have to be honest with yourself and you say, my God, I really am empowered by certain aspects of these patriarchal, racist, sexist, xenophobic folk. And yet at the same time, I'm going to keep track of their ugliness, just as I'm going to keep track of their creative energies that empower me in significant ways.
Thank you so much, Dr. West. Everybody join us in a round of applause. Thank you so very much. Yeah, we'll go during the last remark. Thank you, Howard.